Hi class, this is William. In this video, I want to talk to you about kind of a specific aspect of logos, particularly false logic. As I mentioned before, these are argument forms that are designed to seem logical, but in fact they're not. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as fallacious logic or logical fallacies. On the exam, the way that this material is going to appear, there may be some questions that will be questions about the particular aspect of false logic, but most of the questions will give you a sample argument and ask you to identify which form of false logic it is. In this, we're going to be covering 11 different argument forms that fit under this false logic category. So you will see those 11 options and a 12th option which will say none of these options, which means it could be another form of false logic that we do not cover in this class, or good logic. The key to being able to answer these and to identify or evaluate the logic is to recognize that in its simplest form, an argument consists of your claim, which is what you're trying to prove, and the support, and that's the proof. When you're looking at the argument, always try to primarily focus on the support because that's where you'll find the reasoning or the logic. Does the claim that you're trying to prove follow from the support? So with that in mind, we're going to be going over 11 different forms of false logic. The first one is ad hominem. In an ad hominem fallacy, rather than addressing the merit of someone's idea, we attack the person. We say because there's some characteristic this person has, we should reject their idea. As an example, we shouldn't do Stephen's ideas for the schools. He never went to college. Now, the claim that we're trying to prove is that we shouldn't do Stephen's ideas for the schools. The support, the reasoning we're giving, is that he didn't go to college. Well, just because somebody doesn't go to college doesn't actually mean they can't come up with amazing, good ideas. You'll notice in this argument that the arguer is not telling you anything about his ideas. So they're not showing you how the ideas are bad. Instead, they're saying there's some characteristic about this person. Oftentimes, ad hominem fallacies will take the forms of labels. People will say, oh, they're just a liberal, or they're just a, Karl Marx believed the same thing, or whatever. Anytime people are using labels to describe somebody, like their opponent, always be very suspicious of that. They're asking you to reject somebody's possibly great ideas simply because they're being classified as a certain group or a certain label. The next one is called ad populum. An ad populum fallacy is an appeal to popularity. Here we're being asked to believe something simply because other people believe the same thing. It's the popular opinion. An example of this is 3 out of 4 people prefer Coke to Pepsi. Therefore, Coke must be the better choice. The implication here is because 3 out of 4 people prefer Coke, it must be better. But truth is not a democracy. Reality is not subject to public opinion. 7 billion people can believe something and have it be untrue, while one person stands alone believing something and have it be true. There are certain phrases sometimes that can just tell you something is ad populum. For example, if somebody says something is common sense, common knowledge, everybody knows this. In essence, they're asking you to effectively stop thinking for yourself and simply follow the crowd, follow public opinion or popular opinion. The third one is called a straw man fallacy. A straw man fallacy is a very broad type of fallacy. Here, we're going to basically try to claim that the weakest possible justification for the opposing side must be the only one. This often involves claiming the other side is justifying their position with an argument the other side never actually made. Now, there are various types and forms that a straw man argument can take. I post here on the slide a website that gives some excellent explanation and rundown through several of the different forms of a straw man fallacy and some good examples of each. So I encourage you at this point in the video to pause the video and write down this website. Now that you've got that website, I encourage you to take a few moments, go to that website. It's a very, very short read, but it's very instructive. And it will go through some various examples that will help you better understand the straw man fallacy. The next one is called a false choice. Now you will sometimes hear this one called a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. In this type of logical fallacy, we're told that we have to choose between very few options when in fact there are more. Traditionally, you would be given two choices. You're with us or against us. If you don't like our idea, you must think everything's perfectly fine the way that it is. Well, clever arguers then would add a third option. That was back when it was referred to as a false dichotomy, where you're falsely told you have to choose between two. So they would add a third option and say, well, no, it's not a false dichotomy because you have three options rather than two. But it was really guilty of the exact same problem. So now we call it a false choice. And again, here's an example. You are either with us or against us, or if you don't support our candidate, then you must be supporting our opponent. It implies the fact that a person couldn't be neutral, couldn't like or dislike both. Next, a false authority. Now, the traditional meaning of an authority was expert. So if somebody was an authority in music, they were an expert in music. So here, a false authority, somebody who is an expert or an authority in one subject uses that to try to convince you of something in a completely unrelated subject. The best example of these are oftentimes celebrity endorsements. Michael Jordan may very well be the greatest basketball player to have ever played the game. It doesn't mean he knows anything about shoe design. Yet, if he tells you that a certain pair of Nikes are great shoes, they can triple the price of those shoes and people will still buy them. So just because someone is an expert in one subject does not mean that they know something about every other subject as well. The next one is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Now, the best explanation for this one really is a direct translation from the Latin into English. This means after it, therefore because of it. So when an event happens, we often like to look to the immediately preceding event for a cause. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. If you want to know what caused B, you look to A. If you want to know the effect of B, you look to C. Nice and simple. There's a saying that says there's a simple explanation for everything, and it's wrong. The reality is the world is not this simple. Just because one event preceded another event does not mean that it caused that event. A good example of this probably has happened with many of you. When you're in high school, perhaps you had some chores to do. And if one of your chores was to do the dishes, and mom comes home, well, some days when mom comes home if the dishes aren't done, she may say, I told you need to do the dishes. And we'd say, oh, I'm sorry, Mom, I got busy, and we'd do the dishes, and everything seemed okay. But some days, when the dishes weren't done, it just seems like she loses her mind. I told you to do the dishes, doggone it! And you go in and you frantically start doing the dishes, and then you look at your mom and say, gosh, Mom, I didn't do the dishes. Isn't that an exaggerated reaction? Well, hopefully at this point in your life, you've come to realize that her reaction actually had very little to do with you doing the dishes or not doing the dishes. See, prior to coming home, she was, say, at work. And while at work, she had all this stress and tension thrown at her. Perhaps customers or her boss giving her a hard time, disrespecting her. It builds up. She can't release it at work at her boss or her customers because then she might get fired. So she holds it in, holds it in, holds it in. When she gets home, she usually can kind of gradually and slowly release that tension as she is making dinner or reading a good book. But when she walks in on that day and she's at a boiling point, the dishes not being done is just one more slight slap in the face, one more act of disrespect. So I guess you could say that it's the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. We, of course, know that no straw has broken a camel's back in the history of camels. It's rather all the other things that built up. Sometimes the post hoc ergo propter hoc happens and there's really no connection at all. So just because one event precedes another event does not mean that it caused the event. The next type is perfect is the enemy of the good. Here, a good idea is rejected because it's not perfect. Now, if your company, family, friends, country, whatever, is doing something a certain way, we call that the status quo, the current state. And if it's doing it that way and somebody comes up with a better idea, the better idea should be compared to the status quo. It should be compared to what it's replacing. Or if there are multiple new ideas, the ideas should be compared to the actual alternatives available. But in this logical fallacy, the new idea isn't compared to an actual option available, it's compared to perfection. People will shoot it down because it's not perfect. They point out little problems with it, things that aren't as great as in this person's mind they could be. So just because an idea is not perfect does not mean it's not better or good. But unfortunately, people attack ideas based upon the fact that the idea has a flaw. It isn't perfect, but that's not a reasonable standard. The next one is an appeal to tradition. In an appeal to tradition, a new idea is rejected even though it might be better than how we're doing things now, based upon support for the past. An example of this, and many of you may have had this before, especially if you've been working, a worker comes up with a better way to do something, but the boss rejects the idea because it's just not how we do things here. They'll point to the policies book and say, well, this is how we do it. Another classic example of this is oftentimes when people are debating about what laws we should have. They'll reference the Constitution and they'll say, well, this is what the founders intended. I'm not saying we should violate the Constitution, but when we interpret the Constitution or understand the Constitution, this idea that we should be beholden entirely to what the founders intended back in the 1700s to govern a society in the 21st century, that is an appeal to tradition. The next form of false logic is an argument from ignorance. Argumentum ad ignoradium. This is an appeal to ignorance. Now, ignorance sometimes is seen as being derogatory or offensive, but what we mean here by ignorance is simply not knowing. So here a claim is said to be true because it hasn't been proven false, or it's claimed to be false because it hasn't been proven true. The classic example of this is are people who say that because there has not been proof that there's intelligent life on other planets, we should conclude that there is none. In actuality, the fact that there's not proof that there is or isn't means that we should probably conclude that we don't know. Next is Reductio ad Absurdum. Here we take the logic of someone's argument and extend it out to an absurd conclusion. Because we can't accept absurdity, we should reject this idea. The classic example here is a child steals a candy bar and dad asks, why did you do that? And the child responds, because Bobby did. And dad responds with absurd conclusion that, so if Bobby jumped off a bridge, you would too? It takes the logic the child has of following Bobby's lead and applies it to an utterly absurd conclusion. That if you steal a candy bar because Bobby did, then sometime in the future, perhaps if Bobby jumps off a bridge, you will too. Of course, these are completely different circumstances, and the fact that the child followed Bobby's example in one case certainly does not mean that he would follow it in another case. And because it would be a horrible idea to jump off a bridge doesn't mean it's a bad idea to steal a candy bar, though I think all of us would agree that the child shouldn't have stolen the candy bar. I want to keep these videos to no longer than 15 minutes each if possible, and so I'm going to go ahead and break here, and I will have a part 2 to this video, and we'll go over the remaining forms of false logic. Thank you very much for listening. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.